wonderfully illustrative as these, if you were writing an essay question of this unraveling process, was the fact that one, in the middle 1890s, okay, the Japanese and the Chinese go to war, what is known as the Sino, and when you take the test, it has to be Sino, S-I-N-O dash Japanese. The Sino-Japanese War. Sino, remember, is, strangely enough in English, the adjective form, one of the adjective forms of Chinese. Sino-Japanese War is fought between the two countries. The Chinese had always viewed the Japanese as an inferior, lesser people, okay? And it came as a horrifying jolt to them when the Japanese kicked the stuffing out of them in this war, okay? Their military forces are obliterated by the Japanese because the Japanese are already well on their way to becoming an industrial country. The Chinese have resisted industrialization. They've resisted all these new Western inventions, and they are technologically inferior. Okay? Yeah. The one I'm talking about here, 1894, 95, 96, that time period there. Okay? Number two, in the year 1800 we talked about yesterday, the Society of the Righteous Fist, which you do not need to know, you can call them Boxers, that's what most historians do. There is the Boxer Rebellion. This is also a hint that the Chinese Empire is unraveling, because the situation has become so bad in China, so much of the country are now spheres of influence, or open door ports, that the Chinese people beginning to feel they're losing control of their own nation, okay? And some young Chinese, and those are usually the people that make revolutions, are the young people. Is that too much sun on you, Brett? If it is, you can pull that. You'll either have to move. The right-hand blind doesn't come down, it just falls off. Okay, this is Madison Plain. The left-hand blind works, okay? Is that better now? Yeah, it looks like it's better. Okay. This rebellion rises up against the Westerners. That's the chief opponent. Missionaries are killed, businessmen are killed, etc. But the Chinese government isn't so stupid to not realize that the Boxer Rebellion may be directed at the Westerners, but it's also at least partially directed at the imperial system, which is letting all this take place. So that's the second precursor of what's going to happen. In 1912, there is a revolution. The Dowager Empress dies, and when she dies, okay, her little tiny son, grandson rather, isn't really enough of a leader to do anything, and the whole imperial Manchu dynasty and the whole imperial system comes crashing down. The man who leads that revolution in 1912 is Sun Yat-sen. Okay? Sun Yat-sen was not a saint, but he was a good man who had good ideas on how to make his country once again a good place for his people and a great place in the world. And I'll say three things and then I'll answer anything you want. Thing number one is he wants China to be strong. Okay? That's why he calls his party the Kuomintang, the nationalist party. He was in favor of a strong China. Number two, the second thing that he is in favor of is democracy. He wants the Chinese people to have democracy, to have freedoms. Okay? A very bold idea in 1912. Okay? And number three, the third thing that he wants is he wants to make sure that the Chinese people, he wants to make sure, thank you, that the Chinese people don't starve. Because famine had been a real serious problem. China couldn't feed itself. If everything didn't go just perfectly. If everything went perfectly, they could eke along. But if we had a drought or early freeze or something like that, then you had sometimes hundreds of thousands of people die. Okay? Well, he was well on, I shouldn't say well, he was partially on his way to achieving these things when he dies and his government collapses. This is 1925. I'm going to stop there for a moment. Marissa, what's your question? Okay.
How do you spell dowager? Well,
D-O-W-A-G-E-R, dowager.
Okay.
Dowager. It simply means old, rich woman, wife of a king.
All right.
All right? Everybody all right? Now, when 1925 happens, okay, and at this point, Aaron, you probably need to tune in. When 1925, and Lacey likewise, I love it. I'm not against that. Wish I could be doing it too. When 1925 comes, civil war breaks out in China, okay? At first, the government just sort of disintegrates, Sun Yat-sen's government, in many of the more remote areas, and local kind of Hell's Angel motorcycle types, okay, who obviously weren't riding motorcycles because Chinese didn't have them, but kind of tough guys simply established themselves as warlords, what we call warlords. It's a term you need to know, warlords. And these warlords rule areas. You know, it'd be like Madison County. Somebody takes over Madison County and gives rules, but the central government doesn't have enough power to enforce its will in that area. Okay? Then, okay, take all that one back. The other thing that happens is the government itself splits into two groups. There's two factions that want to run the country. One, of course, is still the nationalists. And this time it's led by somebody called Chiang Kai-shek. So if I were taking notes, I would draw an arrow from Sun Yat-sen to Chiang Kai-shek, because they're like, you know, same party. They're Kuomintang, they're nationalists. Chiang Kai-shek. Another new guy on the block, though, okay, is a fellow by the name of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong. You can just call him Mao. Okay, Mao Zedong. You can call Chiang Kai-shek Chang. Sun Yat-sen, though, almost always is spelled out Sun Yat-sen. It'd be like calling, I don't know, George Washington by some cutie nickname. The two sides, second side, is communist, because by this point we're to about 1927-28. Communists, the ideas of Karl Marx, Communist Manifesto, Das Kapital, as led by Lenin. Lenin and his communist supporters have taken over the government of Russia. Russia and China border each other. And so the ideas is spread down to China. And in 1925, 27, 28, 29, there were a fair number of Americans who were communists. It looked like a good system of government. We're going to discover it doesn't work, but it looked pretty good. So Mao has lots of young Chinese saying, yeah, we want to become a communist nation. And so for the next 5 or 6 or 7 years, you have the two sides going at it, hammer and tong, okay, against each other. At one point in the middle 1930s, it looks like the communists are going to be defeated. Chiang Kai-shek has them cornered in northern China, and it looks like he's about ready to administer the coup d'etat, okay, the ultimate, the coup de grace, if you want to say that, to them and knock them out of the war, okay? When, whatever you may think about Mao, and I happen to think personally he was a pretty bad guy, but I have to give him credit for this. He engineers a miracle. Valley Forge like. He takes his army and marches it through land that nobody is supposed to be able to march through, rough, rugged, terrible terrain, and manages to get around and escape. And in Chinese history, this is called the Long March, okay? And it saves communism in China. Well, the Civil War continues up along and finally kind of fades away for a while because a bigger threat has appeared on the scene. In 1931, the Japanese, who are at the height of their we need to conquer the world mode, okay, which is eventually going to wash up on our shores on December 7th, 1941, they look over at China and see something lying there twitching that they can take over. And so they send the Japanese Imperial Army into China, okay, and undertake in 1931 really the beginning of World War II. Before Hitler, before Pearl Harbor, really World War II began there, okay? And this is some significance when we get about 10 minutes from now. The war goes badly for the Chinese. They're greatly outmatched by the Japanese. They're still an unindustrialized, poverty-ridden peasant society. The Japanese are rapidly closing the gap technologically on countries like the United States and Great Britain. And so the Japanese just beat the living daylights out of the Chinese. And that's bad enough, but the Japanese are also at the height of their very arrogant, we are better than anybody else mode. And we can do anything we want mode, and they inflict hideous atrocities. They view Chinese human beings as beneath dogs, okay? They do things to human beings that no human being, anytime, any place should ever endure. They kill hundreds of we don't know how many, okay? It rivals Adolf Hitler to a degree. And they kill hundreds of thousands of innocent Chinese for no better reason than they don't like them or it's fun, okay? And we gave you just two little tiny examples of a list of 60 things that we could say. We talked about the rape of Nanking, in which they take the southern capital, Nanjing, and just do hideous things. They bomb it and then they occupy the city, and the soldiers are given free rein to do whatever they want. They can do anything they want. There's no repercussions for it, okay? And these are battle-hardened soldiers, and I don't need to explain to you what kinds of things took place. And when it's all over, it has shocked the world, okay? And the other thing is, they're now so bold, the Japanese, that they start actually attacking allied countries, European countries, American countries. In 1937, they claimed at the time it was an accident. I think most historians would agree today it was deliberate. They bombed the USS Panay, P-A-N-A-Y, a United States Navy warship that wasn't doing anything wrong. It was just doing its normal job, and they bombed it and caused international reaction, and really that is the beginning of the United States drift towards policies that are going to lead up to World War II. I think by then the United States realized the Japanese simply can't be trusted. Yes?
Is Panay the name of the boat?
It's the name of a United States Navy warship. It was gunboat. Okay?
P-A-N-Y.
P-A-N-A-Y, Panay. Okay? USS Panay. All right? Now, that's where we were. Mr. Mitchell.
Do the warlords, like, do they favor the party, or do they?
Some of them favored themselves. Some of them favored the nationalists. Probably a few, Mr. Mitchell, and I can give you absolutely no statistics to back this up. This is a Jackson gut reaction, but I think I'm right. Probably the smallest group of them backed the communists, because there's something about the warlord mentality that doesn't make you want to be a communist, because you want to have possessions and riches and all that sort of stuff, and the communists say they don't believe in that kind of thing. Okay?
So
Yes?
Were the warlords kind of like obnoxious people?
They were kind of obnoxious
like
people.
rebellion?
They were mean to the people they ruled, and they were constantly getting in wars with each other and anybody that they could think they could push around and pick on. Okay? Yes, ma'am?
When the Japanese attacked China, did like the communist China and the nationalists like come together to fight?
Oh, wonderful. You're right, and you might want to put this down. I probably should have made a bigger deal out of that. The communists hated the nationalists, and the nationalists hated the communists, but there's something they both hated more than each other, and that's the Japanese. And you might want to write down what Macy said. From about 1936 or 37 onwards, both sides realized that China was fighting for its very existence, and they kind of buried the hatchet. Now, that didn't mean that it was everything was sweet and honey, but they generally cooperated. Also, the United States, once we get into the war, we kind of put a gun to their heads and say, if you want us to provide supplies and equipment to you, you better work together. Anything else? All right, then let's go up to 1949 and we'll take a break. World War II is 1941 to 45 in the Pacific. The major players are the United States, the United States, the United States, the United States, the British, the Chinese versus the Japanese. And I didn't say United States 3 times just because my record stuck. It's because we did the lion's share in the Pacific Okay, British did the lion's share in some other theaters, but we did the lion's share in the Pacific. It was mostly our war. The British don't really show up on large scale in the Pacific until about 1945. Okay. 41, 45 is World War II. 41, 45. Now, the Chinese, though, are a factor. At the end of the World War II, when victory is achieved in the Pacific, and the United Nations is set up, and you think, my God, he's losing his mind, he's now going to the United Nations. I want to illustrate a point. When the United Nations is set up, who are the 5 countries that are the big 5 that to this day hold permanent seats in the Security Council of the United Nations?
U.S.
United States.
France.
France, okay, and they didn't earn it in the Pacific, but they did in Europe, okay.
England.
Great Britain.
Canada.
No. No.
Spain.
No.
China.
China. And?
Germany.
No, they lost the war.
Oh.
Big Russia, okay? The big 5 allies in World War II to this day dominate the United Nations. Okay, some countries don't like this. They are, again, Britain, the United States, France, Russia, and China.
How's Russia?
Okay.
I thought there was Germany.
No, Russia was Germany's principal opponent. Don't ever go to Russia and say that. They call it the Great Patriotic War. 21 million. We lost 390,000. 21 million. 21 million, Mr. Cheney. Russians died getting the Germans out of Russia in World War II.
Then didn't Stalin kind of kill off the rest of them?
And Stalin was killing off many of the rest of them. You're exactly, you understand Stalin, okay? That's how China, okay, is one of the first ways they get into the big league is because they fought on the winning side in World War II. Now, who's my military historian here who knows history well?
Austin.
All right, Austin. Okay, you may not know the answer, but we'll put you on the hot spot. We obviously, if you look at the map, for the first 3 years of the war, we're desperately trying to hang on to Australia. The Australians believe at any moment the Japanese are going to invade them. The Japanese overrun the Dutch East Indies. They overrun the French Indochina. They drive clear down and take the most important base the British have in the Pacific, Singapore. They're clear over to Hawaii. We have no way of helping the Chinese. You can't send goods across the Pacific Ocean. They'll be sunk, okay? So all the supplies have to come in through British territory, India, which is still British territory, India, over the Himalayas, okay, what's called the Burma Road, okay? And there we supply Chinese troops fighting in the western part of China, okay? We also send crated up airplanes that we form a U.S. pro-Chinese, sort of Chinese-American Air Force known as the Flying Tigers. You want to write that down? Excellent. Okay. The Flying Tigers. And the Flying Tigers fly American planes. The pilots are usually Americans. The ground crews are frequently Chinese, and the planes are painted in a style that looks far more Chinese. They have the actual tiger image on the front of the plane. They look much more Chinese than they probably do your typical American plane, but they were kind of the Chinese American manned Air Force in Western China. The Flying Tigers, the Burma. If you ever hear of anybody that served on the Burma Road, okay, you want to go up and shake their hand because they went through hell. Okay, that was terrible duty out in Western China. Thousands of Americans suffered greatly, but getting supplies to the Chinese so they could stay in the war. When the war was over, okay, the Civil War re-erupts, okay. Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong's hatchet immediately comes out of storage, and they go back at it to each other. And in 4 years, despite the fact that we spent billions of dollars supporting Chiang, okay, because he was supposedly non-communist, okay, we spent billions of dollars supporting Chiang, he loses. And by 1949, Chiang is forced to retreat out of China completely, crosses over this little strait of water here to the island of Formosa, also known as Taiwan, T-A-I-W-A-N. I would really use Taiwan. Formosa is the Japanese name for it. T-A-I-W-A-N, to Taiwan. And they're still there. Chiang ruled Taiwan as a dictator, supported by U.S. bucks, okay, until his death in the 1970s. And today, the government on Taiwan is still pro-American, very capitalist, and the only thing that's keeping the Chinese from taking it back is the United States Navy, because we tell the Chinese, if you cross that, you're in deep trouble. Okay, and in your lifetime, they may do it one of these days. A couple times they've rattled their sword. It'd be, as I said the other day, like if somebody took over Hawaii from the United States. Okay, I imagine we Americans would want it back. All right, but right now, our official policy is that Taiwan is a good ally of the United States. It's the heir of Chiang Kai-shek. We defend it. Once he's out of China, Mao Zedong becomes the master of China. And in 1949, in Beijing, get ready to write, 1949, in Beijing, at Tiananmen Square, the largest public square in the world, okay? It's about Tiananmen, don't need to know it. Okay? You shouldn't recognize it when you hear it, but it's this long in English translation to Chinese. And there's a limit to what you can master, so we'll just, at a big square, about 4 times the size of the mall in Washington, okay? It's right in the center of Beijing. At Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong stands up before the Chinese people and says, we, the Communist Party, declare that this is a communist nation and that we are the, new name for China? We are the, pardon me? We gotta add a word, because that was the old name for China, the Republic of China. The people, thank you, Lydia. The People's Republic of China. And that is what they are to this day. And they are so conscious of that word, People's Republic of China, that if you send a letter to China and down at the bottom, after you put, the usual address and stuff, and we just write USA on the bottom as somebody sending it to this country, all you have to do is put USA at the bottom. If you don't put People's Republic of China, the Chinese Postal Service will not deliver the mail. They'll send it back to you. We're not the Republic of China. We're not China. We're the People's Republic of China, founded by Mao Zedong. Okay? Yes?
Why did he have to go to Taiwan?
He was beat, slammed, had the stuffing kicked out of him, lost, whatever word you want to say.
Who had to go to Taiwan?
Chiang Kai-shek. And he establishes a capitalistic dictatorship there. And Taiwan is, to this day, capitalistic. It's not quite as dictatorial as it used to be. My cousin is a missionary in Taiwan, and she comes back, she's been there now for 35 years. When she comes back, she always has some interesting Taiwan stories. Okay, yes?
What did he say?
He said, the speech was obviously longer than what I said, but he said, the communists have taken over, this is now a communist nation, we are, the key line is, we are the People's Republic of China. Okay? Now, last tiny footnote, and then we'll take a break, we'll come back, we're almost done. Last tiny footnote. We got a problem. There's an organization called the United Nations. Which one of these governments is the legitimate? They both claim to represent China. We have Chiang Kai-shek's government, the former Republic of China government, that's been driven into exile, or driven into Hawaii, okay? And we have this new communist government that's taken over, that controls 95% of the country, who represents China for decades in the United Nations. The Republic, Chiang Kai-shek's government represents who guarantees that that government will represent the Chinese people in the United Nations. United States. Okay? You need to know some of this stuff, folks, because there's some reasons some countries don't like us very well. We have a fairly good track record as a nation. I love my country. This is a great place. We're not saints, and we're not perfect, and this one was a really major dummy. Okay? There's about 10 million people living here, and there's about 1 billion living here, and we stand up in the United Nations with a straight face and say, oh, these people don't deserve any representation in the United Nations. Okay? These are the people that represent the Chinese nation. And we do that until the 1970s, for a quarter century. Okay? And finally, the other countries in the world, including some of our best allies, like the British and the French, say to the Americans, listen, boys, you people are out of your mind. And so today, the representative in the United Nations, okay, is now the government in Beijing. The People's Republic of China is one of the big 5 in the Security Council. Yes?
Don't they have a representative for Taiwan?
Taiwan has an observer. Because Taiwan still insists that it's ROC, the Republic of China, and all the world said, we don't care if that's the government out on the island, we'll live with you, that's okay, but you gotta admit to the fact that you're no longer China, you're the government of Taiwan.
He was after
Okay.
some
All right?
whatever.
You
Yeah, I
can
just haven't
be there
really
and
had
talk,
the
but you
time
can't
to
vote.
read it. It's
Okay.
realistic.
Anybody have any questions? Everybody all right? Stand up and stretch, say hello to me. Honey, one minute.
A billion times, not exaggerating. You and me both of us. I think that might be Mr. Ross. No, I think I've heard the sound right here. You and I both know that is a gross exaggeration. When I first said that, she's like, no, it's not. I know. I was her. Come back. I want to be like, really?
Snap back, see my cut through the